I'm going to talk about the wheel of power. Intersectionality. A lot of vegans say, "Oh, we are not intersectional." And I think when you look at this wheel and you see that those people who say that they don't believe in intersectionality or they choose not to be that kind of intersectional, what they are saying is because they are so close to the center that they can afford not to be intersectional or to take an intersectional, approach. So let me just share that first. So the center is where the power lies. I think we all agree that in today's society, and it doesn't matter whether it is in the West or in a country in the global South, our society has been shaped by colonialism and imperialism. So in the center, what we have is a heterosexual, male, cisgender, able-bodied, white, English-speaking man. So that is the dominant group. And these people in the center, they hold the power. And this has been evident in the recent months with all the Western leaders bullying all the other countries, right? And then depending on which of these criteria you don't fulfill, your position shifts away from the center. And the distance from the center determines your power. As you see, there are many factors that play a role, many identities that can overlap and determine your position in this circle, in this wheel of power. And this is actually a very simplified version. There are versions with a lot more identities on it. So let's say language. I mentioned that English is the language of power. Now, it's not just English, it's also the accent, and whether it is your mother tongue or whether you have learned it. Did you study in English? Can you write and read it? You see, even when it comes to just the language, there are so many levels. There is a wide spectrum, and depending on where you are, you can be closer to the center or on the edge. And speaking English with a British or American accent can actually compensate for other shortcomings. Then, for example, a black person speaking American English can have a better position here than a person of color who doesn't speak with an American or British accent. Another example is skin color. If you're white, you are in the center. The darker you are, the farther away from the center you are, the less power you have. And this also applies to people of color, those from Asian and African countries. Even in those countries, if you're very dark, you are less attractive, less appealing. Even in those countries, individuals with lighter skin tones are considered more attractive, more desirable. And that's why I remember when I was in India or even in China, you see all these whitening soaps and facials. So this is a legacy of colonialism, that, lighter skin tones are more desirable. So another example, citizenship. Western citizens are closer to the center. For example, I'm an Austrian citizen, but I wasn't born there. And we saw recently how in France and Germany, some politicians were actually proposing to revoke the citizenships of those Muslims who were not white French or white German citizens, and they were pro-Palestinians. So you see how one identity overlaps with another identity and determines what happens, determines your position and, what happens in your life. Then there are other factors, education, your class, your body shape. Again, because in our society, the mainstream media sells us this idea of a perfect body, which happens to be the shape of most Western people. I mean, people of color have a different body shape, but if your body shape is more like the Western people, it's closer to the center. Then your sexuality, your gender, what is missing here is actually your relationship status. It's not just about whether you are cisgender or heterosexual. It's also about whether you have a partner and whether you have children. I mean, in most societies, despite all the talk about LGBTQ, still being married, having a partner with children has a special status. So being married with children adds to your status. It offers you advantages, while being single with children may be actually of disadvantage. So as mentioned earlier, one identity can compensate for another. You may be a person of color, but you are from a rich, privileged background. You go to a boarding school, you are educated. So those make up for your skin color and take you closer to the center where the power is. And if we think of what's happening in Palestine, I mean, here on this example I have here, religion is actually missing. But religion is very important. If you are Christian, you're closer to the center. And I would say actually right now, Islam is the religion at the margin. And that is, what we see in Palestine. There's a lot of Islamophobia going on. Now, the thing is, if you're in the center, kind of closer to the center, you are blind to the other identities. You just don't see them. You just don't see how it feels to have those identities. And that's why sometimes you see, for example, a white British woman. I actually used to work with one. She was white British, but Jewish. And all she could see and understand was the way she, as a Jewish person, was discriminated. She was ignorant to the privileges she enjoyed because of her skin color, because of her citizenship. So we always see our one identity that is not dominant. And this lady I used to work with, she was blind to other discriminations. It's like a blind spot. You know, when you're driving and you look into the mirrors and there are blind spots, the same can be said about those closest to the center. They simply don't see those at the margins. And if you map your own position on this wheel of power, it won't be a nice round circle. In some identities that you hold, you might be actually closer to the center, but some other identities that you have, you actually, you may be somewhere in the middle, or you may be more on the outskirts.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that species is a missing link here, huh?
But if you look at it, animals, do they have citizenship? No. Skin color doesn't even apply to them. So animals are actually they don't even make it to the circle.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. Just at the inner circle of power is also being human.
Good point. Yes, you could actually argue that it is just made for humans, which again would you could say even this, although it is trying to decolonize our minds, it is still a colonial tool because nature is not there.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
So when you look at it and you think of your own kind of, let's call it intersection of identities or the different identities that you carry, how does that make you feel? Have you ever thought of it? When we talk about speaking of for Palestine, for example, I believe that the closer you are to the center, the more power you have, but then the more privilege you have. So it is, in a way, you have more responsibility because it is easier for you. If you lose some of those privileges, you are still in a good position. Whereas when you're on the margins and you speak up for Palestine and you lose your job, for example, it could be a big hit to your life and, to your situation.
Yeah, I'm just white middle class person, and I never experienced being discriminated against, except I'm 77, and now I deal with ageism. And it's really, really interesting. All the so-and-so horrible, ex-voters, well, they're all in their 60s and 70s. No, it hasn't, hurt me, but it's given me a tiny, tiny, tiny taste of being discriminated against, which I just never, ever experienced that in any way at all in my whole life. And the other thing I want to say is, I noticed that all the people, the world leaders, are all in the middle of the circle. I don't know how to fight this power. I've been watching this, I'm a child of the 60s. This is nothing new. These governments have been doing this all over the world, everywhere. So but for me, what Vegans for Palestine is really, for me, like the beginning of a movement of vegans for liberation. We've got to put a stop to this. And I see this as the beginning of the end of colonial imperialism, but they're not going to go Egypt. So that's why it's so important that we stick together, and so important that we keep finding each other and expanding.
You're right, all these world leaders are in the center. But again, if you look at the circle, the center, there's actually a small number. Those on the margins are larger population. And I think we say global majority. And global majority, yes, they have less power, but they are actually more larger in numbers. 80% of the world population is actually people of color, or what we call global majority nowadays. And that is where the power lies. A white American woman who works in DEI, and she said that the real change will happen from the people who are on the margins, because they can actually have a good overview of what is going on. That is what she said. Real change will come actually from those people.
And I would agree that supports essentially what Craig McIver also said. The change will come from the people. when I looked at that chart, I kept looking at it and going, I'm kind of following the circle, and it's like, oh, wait a minute. Not all, but the majority in that center are male. If you're women, you automatically jump off the center. It's just the way it is. I'm fortunate. My mother was born in Chile. My father was born in Norway. I grew up with two accents in the house at all times. And I also grew up in San Francisco in the Haight-Ashbury during the 60s. And my school was so multicultural. It was wonderful. And I've realized over the years that so many people do not have that. They didn't have that amazing exposure to all these cultures that I had growing up as a kid. But I'm definitely not in the middle. I'm somewhere on I'm more in the center of that wheel.
I must say, I was listening to Brit Hart, and she said actually during one of the conferences, one of her webinars, she said somebody was asking her about racism in other countries. But she said that actually she's aware, although she's black, but because she's American and educated, when she goes to other countries, she may be actually perceived as white. Being American puts a lot of people up, close to the center, to be honest. And that is something I experienced when I was in China with a group of Americans, and I could see how they were treated and how I was treated, even if it was like female American versus me. So yes, being American actually, for whatever reason, it puts you closer to the center. But what you mentioned about men being in the center, we see that in the vegan movement. The majority of vegans are actually women, but who gets all the speaking engagements? Who are all these people with the large platforms? So yeah, we see that in the vegan movement quite a lot as well. Yeah, thank you.
I totally agree with everything everyone said. I'm as close to the center as you can get on things. But I guess all I want to say is that I think it is slightly more complicated in like specific ways. Like I'd say like black men and black women kind of have their own unique way of experiencing that, experiencing racism. And it's like both is kind of informed by their gender. Like black men are kind of perceived as dangerous and in a certain way. And I mean, I think the wheel of power is very important and good, but I think that you can be like kind of in between there in certain ways, certain not. I'm not even sure where I'd stand in the education thing. Like I only went through elementary school, but then I went to private school, but it was like not accredited private school, and then community college, and I worked after that. That's all I'd like to say. It's just kind of complicated.
Thank you for pointing out that it is kind of fluid. It changes. It's not a fixed position that you have on the wheel. Depending on, if I'm in the UK, I'll be somewhere else. When I move to a different country, again, I'm somewhere else. It keeps changing because depending on where you are, one of your identities will stand out. If I'm at workplace and I used to be a doctor, and if I'm standing there as a doctor, my education will be the more important identity at that time. So it keeps moving, it keeps moving quite a lot. It is fluid, but in general, when you go, let's say I go out and nobody knows who I am. Nobody knows my education background, and that is usually what happens when you go out. We don't have a label saying I'm vegan, I have this education, I'm single, I have children. We don't have a label like that. You just go there. People look at your body. Are you able-bodied or not? What is your body shape? Body size, age, gender. So all of that. That is how people start judging you, and depending on how they judge you, they start, treating you differently. And that is what happens with oppression, for example, that, a group of people, like what we see with Palestinians at the moment, a group of people are being judged based on their religion, and that the way they live is different than what they do. For me, when I look at Palestinians with all these hijabs and all that, I'm used to that because I'm from Iran. They look like Iranians to me. But to a Western person, that looks like a Muslim. All they see is a Muslim. I don't see a Muslim. I just see a human being. So they are being judged quite a lot on their religion, actually. And when Islam has been made into a terrorist religion, then obviously that is how they are going to be treated. For example, I know my brothers, especially their name is Muhammad. It's like such a Muslim name. And I know that when they go on the street, and because of the gender, again, you see, although we said men are more in the center, sometimes it can be actually a disadvantage. As a Muslim man, they are seen as a terrorist, whereas I'm not seen as a terrorist straight away. Maybe later, if I was wearing hijab. You see what John was saying, that, yes, men, although they can be in the center, but depending on another identity, they might actually be seen more as a threat. So yes, it is fluid, and sometimes your gender is not going actually to help you. Let's put it that way.
I agree that sometimes being a male doesn't really help you have the power, especially when it comes to sexual violence, where women are not believed when they say they were raped, and men are even less believed than women. So I'm from Romania, I'm white and able-bodied but fat and a woman and so on. I mean, being discriminated against being a woman, I'm kind of, because I'm not so young anymore, I'm kind of over it, I got used to it and it doesn't shock me anymore. But actually being discriminated for being Eastern European, it's very surprising each time it happens. So I haven't traveled outside of Europe. I've traveled to Western Europe quite a bit in business capacity. So I'm a visual artist. I talk to people who are curators or other artists or in production work. And the discrimination happens to the highest level. So with my peers or curators or directors of museums, never in production work, where I think the fact that I'm from Eastern Europe makes me more approachable and one of the people, let's say. In my own country, I think I'm quite advantaged for being very white. But the thing with taking a stand on some issue, because in Eastern Europe there's so much, or maybe I shouldn't generalize like this, but in Romania there's so much going on and people are always protesting and signing petitions and that. So a thing that I've heard from people, why aren't you being vocal about other things than, eating vegan or, just like the basic vegan things, is that we have enough on our mind. We are in Eastern Europe, we are Romanians, we are struggling with so much. Yeah, we are burdening Ukraine, which is a warring country. We are dealing with Ukrainian refugees. We are trying to help them. And it feels like in my country, we kind of only care about our specific problems and the ones of our neighbors. And everything else is kind of too much to handle. And I think that's also happening with some other women, Like I said about myself, I got so used to hearing shit about, talking too loud or staring too proud or shit like that, I got so used to that I sometimes feel tired of speaking up for, other people that are having the same kind of treatment. And I have to remember myself that even though, for me, it's kind of like this is a business day as usual or business as usual, still people should not be put through this kind of treatment, and still because I am older, I should kind of support other people who are maybe not as used to as me.
Thank you. It was quite interesting because I feel like you mentioned a lot of things that you got used to it. As somebody who has been discriminated against all my life, racism, I'm so used to it. But we shouldn't. We shouldn't be used to all this. It's not right. Also, depending on your identities, you're sometimes more vulnerable when you speak up. We always adjust depending on how vulnerable we are, and we should be. We need to be careful as well. Our safety is also important. I agree. Thank you.
Just really quickly, I've been learning so much about why so many Israelis are so hateful and spiteful and disregarding and just disgusted by Palestinians. And it's like, so in the power circle, they're not even on the charts for most Israelis. You know, I mean, they're just so not talked about. If they're talked about with fear and terror. And so it's just one of those really stark examples of what happens when you're raised with prejudice like that.
That is well said. If you haven't watched Israelism, I really highly recommend it. When you watch it, you realize that actually for most Israelis, for Zionists actually, let's call them Zionists. For Zionists, Palestinians don't even exist. It's like something annoying, you just want to get rid of that.
It takes nothing away from your animal rights advocacy to recognise other forms of oppression. It's really important.
For me, this is what veganism was always about. Was a decent, compassionate world for everybody.
Taking the vegan stance isn't just about the anti-oppression of non-human animals.
I mean, I've never really trusted our institutions all that much, but I trust them less now. Quite honestly, I am starting to see a lot of people's true colors, and I just, you know, as maybe it comes from ignorance that I ever trusted that democratic, or not democratic, but, you know, modern, you know what I mean, like, neoliberal institutions would actually be able to handle this. It's really cool to see a vegan perspective on this. You don't really see that much. Like, I think one good example of how veganism could be connected to this is how, like, pets or Palestinian pets have, you know, forced to live in these conditions, or zoos that, you know, animals could have escaped and basically are having to deal with all this. So yeah, it is all connected.
I agree with you. We were living under this illusion that there are some rules. There's a good and bad, and we all agree on what is good and bad. And there are people who have more power who are there to protect us. I think, yeah, there was some illusion, and now we are losing all of that. But you mentioned something about the vegan perspective on that, and we have been actually discussing this quite a lot. You know, if you look at veganism as just about animals, then you would say, oh yeah, vegan perspective. But if you look at the veganism as an anti-oppression movement, then obviously we need to speak about, you know, Palestine.
I've been a vegan animal rights activist for 35 years. One of the things that I learned was to be prepared for the next horrible thing I'll learn, which is 3 or 4 times a week there's some new horrible thing. But this is just the pit of humanity. And the silence of people is just as bad as for me. All these vegan animal rights activists I've known personally for, 30, 40 years, endorsing, and they're not thinking, but what they say is it has to happen. We have to get rid of Hamas so Jews can be safe around the world. And they are now less safe than they've ever been, I assert. I mean, I'm just sick to my stomach almost all the time. And what the people in Gaza are saying is, keep posting, keep talking. Now is not the time. We don't have the privilege of sitting back and doing nothing. If all we do is post, at least that's the least that we can do. And right now, these people need food and water. Please keep sharing, keep posting. It means a lot to those people. One guy put a video out. He wanted to share his new hotel, and it was his new tent. And he was so proud, and he said, down the block here, we have the hospital, and it's like a person standing there with a first aid kit.
I agree about sharing as well. That is the one thing they want us to do. I mean, that is really the only thing they want us to do. Just share like crazy. If you have a platform, and they say it doesn't matter if you have 100, followers or 10,000. It just doesn't matter. Just share.
The silence from the vegan community is so disappointing, and I know that we've covered this previously, and I'm kind of not surprised, but I really am really disappointed. Feel really overwhelmed at times by how many terrible things are happening in the world, and I completely understand that. But to dismiss things that aren't part of your specific worldview is abhorrent. So I'm not really interested in spending a lot of time in trying to encourage vegans to care about things that they don't see as important. Like, to me, it's a waste of my emotional energy. I'm far more interested in what can I actually do here to contribute to some change. So the times I feel extremely helpless, I'm so angry at I have to say, my government, the Australian government, in pausing, they're saying at the moment, funding to UNRWA. There's no money for aid going to Palestine. And I think, we contribute something like, $18 million. So out of the whole pool, it's not a huge amount, but every single dollar and cent counts. So, with all of that, I sort of feel so terribly guilty that we are complicit with starving people to death. So I do feel really helpless and hopeless at times, but that's a privilege to be able to put down my phone and walk away for a minute. So I feel really guilty about that. So now I'm just thinking I just need to ramp up even more in calling government and just saying, this is not in my name.
All of these governments, they are complicit. And I agree with you. The minimum we can do is say it's not in our name. But when it comes to funding the UNRWA, I feel like at the moment, no aid is getting in. I'm just thinking that is actually more a distraction at the moment, what they are doing, saying, we are not going to fund that anymore.
So yeah, lots of seething resentments and bad feelings to my government, the Conservative government, who are very much funding willfully and knowingly these atrocities. So help get the word out even more and educate myself and help educate others around me, because I also find that most of my vegan activist companions are being silent about things as well. But yeah, it's just feeling very sad and even vexed about how lots of my friends who are good people and always trying to reduce the suffering in the world and everything, but often just don't want to talk about Palestine or these war crimes going on and everything, or all these genocidal actions which are beyond horrific.
I liked something you said. Good people who are trying to reduce the suffering, but they are silent now. And that reminded me of something I read on Instagram that, somebody had written, it was from a Jewish person. My grandmother said that during Nazi, all the good people were quiet and let it happen. And I think that is where the disappointment comes, and the sense of betrayal almost, like kind of vegans, we assume that they're good people. Especially vegan activists who are always very loud, talking about, how not to harm animals. So they're good people doing good things. And then suddenly they're, silent. And you're just trying to make sense of it. How is that possible and why?
So I've been vegan almost 10 years, but it wasn't until about 4 years ago, maybe, where I felt like I finally found my tribe. And it was through meeting a bunch of other vegans and getting into some vegan activism. And it was just like, literally, I felt like I found my people, and to have the majority of those people go silent, or one in particular right after October 7th, went absolutely ballistic towards me for daring to post ceasefire now. But that sense of betrayal and deep sadness and abandonment, sort of an abandonment, because now it's like, oh my gosh, I don't have that circle anymore. And along that same note, within my family, because I am the only vegan. Yeah, so there's a rift. I have a rift with my sisters, which is really sad. Yesterday, I'm looking at the screen, one of my sisters finally posted something about Gaza. Now, the way she posted it was kind of weird, because one of the things she says is, well, I don't share much on what I read in the news or from what source or which documentaries I watch, does not mean that I have not been following this horrible war, nor do I assume my friends and family don't either. I know we all share the same feelings of outrage and horror. What can stop this killing? And she says, my intention is not to offend, hurt anyone ever. And I was the first responder, and I said, I show profusely, because that's what journalists in Gaza and the West Bank are begging us to do. And if I were in their shoes, I'd be begging people to do the same. Per Craig McIver, ex-UN Officer of Human Rights Commissioner, who quit in protest, his hope is not in the government, but in the people speaking out. And she writes back, it feels like thoughts and prayers to me. It is the least one could do if you think a difference can come of it. My pessimism is a bitch. This was followed by a huge, long rant by some friend of hers who's clearly a Zionist Jew. And her response to her friend is, I respect your words. I respect you. I'm so sorry that my post has hurt you. Please forgive me. I love you. These are troubling times, and the struggle to understand all the sides are impossible to me. I fear the killing will never stop. And then she says, thank you for speaking out. I am listening with both my heart and mind. And it's just, excuse my French, the fucking bullshit new age bubble world she lives in. Don't lower my happy aura, my vibes, whatever the hell.
The court decision last Friday was not a win, but it was a win in many ways. It's the first time that Israel has actually been held accountable on the world stage for the horrors they've been perpetrating for decades. Don't let people tell you that we lost, because in many ways it's very, very positive. And there's people suing Biden now, and that court, you know, to hear in an American courtroom the listing of what Israel has been doing is just really inspiring. And I've seen so many people wake up to the political systems that run the world, that you can see versus the people in the street versus the leadership. There's more of us.
I'll just say a couple of sentences about the ruling last week. I know it wasn't what we all expected, but you know, Israel wants us to believe that it was nothing, it was not important. So I think we need actually to say, no, what they said, it carries a lot of weight, even though it wasn't what we wanted. But we need actually to make it sound like, yes, that is important, and we're going to hold you accountable. Thank you for joining me today, and I really enjoyed it, and I'm really glad that we have this space where we can talk. Thank you, everybody.